Welcome to the Sport Whisper, where legends are told, not just timed, where history isn't just measured in gold medals, but in laughter, setbacks, late-night dreams, and early morning sprints through red clay. If you love sports, not just the scores, but the stories, then you've come to the right place, because this is the story of a boy who outran his chores, outran his school books, and eventually outran the world. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of storytelling, feel free to subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, lean back, close your eyes if you'd like, and let me take you to Trelawney, Jamaica, where barefoot kids race goats, and one of them, one lanky boy with mischief in his grin, would grow up to change sprinting forever. Chapter 1. Trelawney Roots, Dirt Tracks and Big Dreams. You wouldn't know it from the medals, the headlines, the way the world came to pronounce his name with awe and rhythm. But Usain Bolt was born in a place where time moved slow. Not in laziness, not in defeat, but in the kind of slow that grows things. Trees, children, dreams. Sherwood Content wasn't famous. It wasn't big. Just a speck in the Jamaican parish of Trelawney, hidden between the hills and the sugar-cane fields, where the roads were cracked and the air smelled of rain and cooking oil. There were goats that wandered into yards like they owned them, and kids that raced barefoot through red clay trails, their laughter louder than the old radios playing ska and cricket commentary from cracked verandas. That was the place. That was the rhythm. And into that rhythm, on August 21st, 1986, a boy was born with legs too long and energy too wild to fit into anything calmly. He came out big, not fat, just long. Long arms, long fingers, long limbs that seemed unsure of what to do with themselves. His mother, Jennifer, said he cried more than the others. His father, Wellesley, said he moved more. But what they both noticed early, before the world had a chance, was that the boy couldn't sit still. Not in church, not at school, not even in his sleep. He twitched and flinched like something inside him was already running. The Bolts weren't rich, not poor in the way that starves you, but poor in the way that keeps you counting. Counting meals, counting shoes, counting how long the school uniform could last before the elbow split. They ran a grocery shop, modest and tired, where dusty shelves held tinned sardines and bags of flour, and every transaction came with a little negotiation. Usain helped out sometimes, but only for a moment. He'd weigh the rice, maybe carry a bag to a neighbor's bike, then vanish down the street chasing a chicken, or challenging a friend to race to the mango tree and back before his mother could yell his name. Because running came before everything. Not organized, not planned, just wild running. Down hills, through puddles, over fences, past gardens. No warm-ups, no lanes, no coaches, just instinct. His friends said he ran like a man being chased by something no one else could see. And when he ran, he laughed. Head tilted back, arms flapping, legs loose like vines in the wind. The teachers noticed first. Not his grades. Those came and went like the clouds. But his speed. During recess, while others kicked a ball or traded snacks, Usain challenged anyone, everyone. "Bet you I reach the gate before you blink," he'd shout. And sometimes, it felt like he was right. His primary school, Waldensia, didn't have fancy facilities. The track was a patch of flattened grass. The classrooms had fans that wheezed and chalkboards stained from years of stories. But they had Miss Wedderburn, a PE teacher with an eye for movement and a heart full of patience. She saw the boy, saw how he turned corners without slowing, how his strides devoured ground like a machete through cane. She told him to take it seriously. He grinned, scratched his head, and asked if he still had to do math homework. He didn't think of himself as an athlete, not yet. He thought of himself as a boy who could run faster than the rain. And in a place like Trelawney, that was enough. Because here, Speed wasn't a sport. It was a language, a way to show off, a way to belong. And when you ran fast, people noticed, people smiled. But there was something else, something quieter. At home, behind the energy, behind the joking and the teasing, there was a boy who watched everything. Watched his mother fold laundry late at night with tired hands. Watched his father fix old radios with silent concentration. Watched older boys leave town for Kingston, chasing work, chasing hope. And though he didn't say it out loud, the idea began to grow. What if running could be more than just fun? What if it could be a way out? His bedroom was small, a mattress, a fan, a window that looked out at the trees. But in his mind, he saw stadiums. Not clearly, not yet. Just flashes, the sound of crowds, the feel of wind. He didn't write these dreams down. He ran them. There's a story, the kind that lives in villages long after the facts have blurred. That one evening, during a community cricket match, a ball flew into the bushes and disappeared. Usain volunteered to fetch it. Someone joked, "Don't take all day now." And in less than a minute, he was back, grinning, panting, ball in hand. Someone whistled. Someone else said, "That boy's got rocket feet." The nickname came later, Lightning. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he struck. By the age of 10, he was already a local legend. Not officially, no trophies, no headlines, but in the way people spoke of him. "That Bolt kid," they'd say at the shop. "Did you see what he did at the school sports day?" Grandmothers shook their heads, mothers smiled with quiet pride, and boys started measuring themselves against him. But he wasn't arrogant. Not yet. He was cheeky, sure, loud when he wanted to be, but never cruel, never too proud to lose. He loved winning, of course, but he loved racing more. The chase, the thrill, the way the world disappeared when you moved fast enough. His body was still growing. He tripped often, stumbled, sometimes finished second. But there was no fear in him, no hesitation. His legs were learning, his lungs expanding, his mind beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, he had something. The first time he wore spikes, he laughed. "Me no need dem," he said in thick patois. "Me fast enough barefoot." But when he tried them, when the track gripped instead of slipped, something clicked. Not just in his feet, in his heart. This was different. This was the beginning of something real. There were no scouts in Sherwood Content, no sports academies, just neighbors, teachers, a few well-meaning coaches who used their own money to buy stopwatches and Gatorade. But still, word spread. Trelawney knew. The parish began to whisper. "There's a boy, a tall one. Watch him." And beyond the hills, in the cities, in the capital, the system was beginning to stir. Jamaica's high school athletics scene, champs, loomed on the horizon like a mountain. That's where reputations were forged, where champions were born. And soon, very soon, the boy who once chased chickens through bush trails would step onto that stage. But not yet. For now, he was still that child. Half mischief, half miracle. Eating dumplings after school, sprinting through puddles, racing the sunset. A boy who didn't know the world would one day chant his name in stadiums built for gods. He just knew he liked to run. And when he ran, the world felt quiet. But the silence didn't last forever. Because in Jamaica, even the quiet boys are eventually pulled into the sound. And for someone like Usain, someone whose legs spoke louder than his voice ever could, the sound came knocking early. There was always someone watching, always someone with a stopwatch, a clipboard, or just a whisper and a good memory. Word spread like sugar through tea. A local race, a parish meet, a cousin who knew a teacher who knew a coach. And soon, Usain was invited to run, not just in Sherwood content, but in the next town over, then another, then another. He didn't know what it meant. He just saw new fields, new faces, new challengers, and he liked that. He liked lining up next to strangers, hearing the breath of boys who wanted the same thing he did, to feel their feet float. There was no plan, not yet, no grand ambition, just that feeling, the rush, the hush, the flight. At home, things stayed the same. Chores, church, laughter at the dinner table. His mother kept him grounded, not by scolding, but by rhythm. She believed in prayer and routine. Up before sunrise, clothes pressed, manners intact. She wasn't strict, not like a hammer, but like a steady hand. His father, quieter, watched from the background, proud in his own way, always ready with a nod and a quiet, good run that meant more than any trophy. There were bumps, of course. Always are. A stomach bug before a meet. A bruised toe from climbing a tree the day before a race. Once, he fell face first at the start line, tripped on his own nerves, laughed it off, but cried later when no one was looking. He was a child still. Dreaming big doesn't erase that. But something else began to happen too. He started to win. A lot. More than before. And people began to expect it. That changes things. Suddenly, he wasn't just the tall kid who ran fast. He was the one you were supposed to beat, and almost never could. Pressure, they call it. He didn't know the word then, but he felt it. In the eyes of his rivals, in the cheers of the crowd, in the way silence followed him if he didn't win by enough. He began to feel a strange itch. Not fear. More like restlessness. Like the village was too small now. Like his feet knew there were bigger places to run. He still smiled, still joked, still raced through the market for fun. But something inside him had changed. He'd seen glimpses of crowds, of cameras, of the bigger world. The family couldn't afford luxuries, no private coaching, no personal trainers, but they gave what mattered. Freedom, encouragement, a rooted sense of self. Jennifer still reminded him to say thank you after a win. Wellesley still sent him to fetch water even after he brought home a medal. Fast or not, you still live here, he'd say, half serious, half smiling. At night, Usain began to imagine new things. Not just stadiums, but music playing as he entered. Flags waving, his name on lips that didn't speak patois. He didn't know what those images meant yet. He didn't know that his stride, already so distinct, would become the most famous in the world. But he began to believe, not in destiny, but in the possibility of more. Then came the letter. From William Knibb Memorial High School. An offer. Not a scholarship, not quite, but an invitation to train, to grow, to run among boys just like him. Hungry, gifted, ready. He didn't hesitate. His parents didn't either. They packed his bag with folded uniforms, secondhand shoes, and quiet hope. When he arrived at Knibb, he looked around like a child seeing the sea for the first time. Bigger kids, louder voices, real tracks with real lanes, coaches with whistles, girls in bleachers. It was overwhelming and perfect. He felt small and large at the same time, like a grain of sand with a storm inside. But that's another story. This one ends where the boy begins to step into the light, where the dirt paths of Sherwood content, rich with sweat and barefoot dreams, begin to fade behind him. Where the mango trees and cricket fields give way to starting blocks and bleachers. Where the boy who ran without knowing why starts to understand the shape of his own fire. And yet, even as the world slowly moved toward him, even as the clock began to count not just seconds but fractions of glory, Usain Bolt never forgot the stillness. that field behind his house, that moment before the wind caught his stride, that place where his feet found flight and his soul found silence. He would become fast, then famous, then something bigger than both. But before all that, before the medals, the flashbulbs, the gold-tipped shoes, he was just a boy in Trelawney. A boy who ran because it felt like flying. A boy who ran because for a few seconds at a time, nothing else in the world mattered. Kapitel 2. Wild talent. Running ahead of rules. At Waldensia Primary, the desks were old and carved with names. The chalkboards cracked like dry soil, and the fans spun with the tired rhythm of classrooms that had seen too much heat and not enough rest. But it wasn't the creaking wood or the hum of midday flies that gave the place its electricity. It was him, the tall, wiry boy who couldn't stay still even when the teacher's glare could melt paint. Usain. He was a headache to some, a hurricane to others. Always late, always loud, always moving. He leaned his chair back so far it nearly kissed the floor. He threw pencils across the room to challenge friends to a duel. He'd run laps around the schoolyard just because the bell hadn't rung fast enough. And yet, even the teachers who sighed at his chaos couldn't help but smile. Because underneath the noise, there was magic. Untamed, unpredictable, sometimes exhausting, but undeniable. He wasn't cruel, just restless. The kind of child who burned through minutes like paper. Who asked, why? Not because he wanted to argue, but because the world moved too slowly for his curiosity. His hands drummed desks. His feet tapped tiles. His thoughts galloped like horses over hills. And when he was punished, as he often was, he'd shrug, grin, and whisper to a friend, "At least me beat them to lunch?" Still, it wasn't all games. Somewhere between the mischief and the mayhem, there were moments when the room quieted. During reading time, he listened, not always to the story, but to the rhythm. He liked how words moved when they were well chosen. He didn't say that out loud, didn't know how. But it stayed with him, the way a sentence could build, then snap. The way something slow could suddenly become fast. Just like him. But school was school. And for all his speed, the system didn't move to his beat. Tests bored him, discipline boxed him in. And though he never meant harm, trouble followed him like a shadow that refused to lag behind. His mother tried to keep him on track. Jennifer was sharp, proud, and full of that particular Jamaican strength that mothers pass down like gospel. She made him do chores, made him attend church, made sure his uniform was clean, even when the money wasn't enough for new shoes. "You represent me," she'd say, pressing his collar straight. "Act like it." He'd nod, half listening, eyes already on the horizon. Then came sports day. Every Jamaican school had one. A day when math books were closed, teachers became cheerleaders, and the sun bore witness to battles more intense than anything on a chalkboard. Races, relays, long jump, high jump. It was the Olympics of the bush. And in Sherwood content, it was the day Usain Bolt stopped being a problem and started becoming a legend. The first race, he ran barefoot. The second, too. By the third, someone tried to lend him shoes. He declined. "Me no need dem," he said with that familiar glint. He crouched at the start line like a foal learning to pounce, then exploded forward like he'd been waiting his whole life for the signal. He didn't just win, he demolished. Kids gasped. Teachers gawked. The finish line seemed embarrassed it hadn't stretched farther. After that, there was no going back. He became the school's secret weapon. Whenever visitors came, district coaches, community leaders, even the odd TV crew, someone would inevitably whisper, "Bring out the tall one." And Usain would trot out, lanky and loose, a grin on his face and fire in his legs. But fame, even in small doses, is a funny thing. It flatters. It feeds. And for a child like Usain, adored but still untamed, it inflated the already growing sense that rules were suggestions and boundaries were negotiable. He cut class more than once, wandered off campus, talked back, not with malice, but with a stubborn belief that his way made more sense. One time, after being reprimanded for disrupting a math lesson, he stood up, hands on hips, and declared, "If my can count seconds, me can count money too." The class erupted. The teacher didn't. He got detention. Again. Yet punishment never stuck to him for long. Like water on oil, it slid off. And when he ran, really ran, all was forgiven. Because when he moved, the air changed. Even the strictest teacher fell silent. Even the most cynical onlooker had to admit, this wasn't normal. This was something else. Local meets followed, parish-level competitions. He started to travel, not far, but far enough to feel different. Far enough to see that his gift extended beyond dusty tracks and mango groves. He wasn't always the fastest anymore. Sometimes he tripped, sometimes he lost, but even when he didn't win, people watched him. Something in the way he moved. A looseness. A joy. As if the pressure hadn't found him yet. But it was coming. Because Jamaica, small though it was, took its sprinting seriously. Very seriously. Every boy who won a race carried 1,000 dreams, not just of his own, but of neighbors, teachers, cousins, strangers. Maybe this is the next one, they'd say. And that weight, invisible but immense, was beginning to settle on young Bolt's shoulders. He didn't feel it fully, not yet. For now, it was still a game, a challenge, a way to prove something in a world that didn't always have space for loud, leggy boys who talked too much and learned too little from scoldings. But under the games, a current began to stir. A sense that this couldn't go on forever. That he couldn't just keep laughing off detentions and skipping drills. That talent, no matter how bright, needed shape. And somewhere, deep down, Usain Bolt began to sense it too. There was a man once, a PE teacher from another parish, who came to one of the district meets just to scout talent for his cousin's school. He watched every race like a detective, taking notes, squinting at split times, shaking his head at sloppy form. But when Usain ran, the man stopped writing. He put down his pen, folded his arms, and simply stared. And after the race, which Bolt, of course, had won by a long breath, he said, half to himself, "That boy not running, that boy dancing." It was true, in a way. Bolt didn't run like the others. He didn't drive forward like a machine or churn his legs like gears. He flowed. He bounced. His knees came high, his arms loose, his stride so long it looked impossible to catch. There was no rigidity in him, no textbook angles. And yet, he was always there first. But with that came something he hadn't known before. Expectation. At first it was small. A teacher who said, "Win for the school now." A neighbor who patted his shoulder and added, "Make us proud." But then it grew. Bigger meets, bigger crowds, whispers from coaches. And soon, Usain was not just a boy who ran fast. He was the boy, the one who had to win. It messed with his head more than he let on. He started to overthink, started to question. What if he stumbled? What if the others caught up? What if the people cheering now became silent tomorrow? He didn't say these things out loud. Pride wouldn't let him. But they hung in his chest like rocks in a stream, slowing the current just enough to feel it. And then came the worst part. Boredom. Not with running, never with that, but with the rest of it. The rules, the drills, the lectures. He didn't want to stretch before warm-ups. Didn't want to write down goals in a notebook like some of the more disciplined kids. He wanted to run, not plan. And because of that, he kept clashing with authority. Teachers, coaches, principals. One day, He skipped training to go swimming in a nearby river with friends. He knew it was wrong, knew there was a big meet that weekend. But the water called, and his legs followed. When he came back, sunburned and unapologetic, the coach made him sit out the next race. He didn't argue, but he sulked, loudly. "Me fast and you know it," he muttered, slouched against the fence. "Me don't need no lap runs." The coach walked away, shaking his head. "Speed without discipline is just noise." Usain laughed, but deep down, the words clung. Because part of him knew that he couldn't keep freelancing forever. That raw talent, no matter how bright, eventually fades if not sharpened. And though he wasn't ready to admit it, a voice inside him had started to whisper, "If you want more, you'll have to change." Still, he kept being Usain, irreverent, funny, full of mischief. He teased teammates at the start line, made faces at the crowd, waved before crossing the finish just to see if he still had time. Sometimes he won with his shoes untied. Once, he pretended to nap on the track before his heat. The crowd howled. The officials rolled their eyes, but everyone watched. And through it all, he kept getting faster. Even when he wasn't trying, he was improving. His legs were growing into themselves, his stride longer, his breathing more controlled. He didn't train like the others, didn't take ice baths, didn't count calories. But nature kept gifting him inches, strength, timing. It was unfair, but it was also real. At home, things were quieter. Jennifer noticed he had started eating more. Wellesley said he walked with a different posture, a bit more upright, a bit more aware of his size. His little brother, Siddiqui, started trying to race him down the lane, though he never won. And though the Bolt household didn't talk much about pressure or dreams, there was a sense now, unspoken but shared. He might be something. But how big that something could be that no one knew. Then came the invitation. A regional prep camp. 4 days, real coaches, timed drills, video analysis, the works. It was the first time Bolt saw athletes who were not just fast, but serious. Boys who didn't joke before warm-ups, who followed meal plans, who stretched for 45 minutes without saying a word. It stunned him. Not because he couldn't keep up, he could, but because he didn't understand how they lived like that. He called home on the second night. "Mummy," he said, "these boys don't laugh." Jennifer chuckled on the other end. "Maybe you give them a reason to." By the last day, one of the senior coaches pulled him aside. Tall man, gray in the beard, voice like gravel and thunder. "Boy," he said, "you ever decide to take this serious, the whole world gon' know your name." Bolt didn't answer right away. He just looked down at his feet. Dirt on the soles. Grass on the laces. Feet that didn't know how to stop moving. Then he looked up and said, "Me just like running, sir." And that was the truth. He didn't want medals, not yet. Didn't want headlines or contracts or records. He just wanted that feeling. That moment when the wind was behind him and the ground disappeared and time bent into something soft and beautiful. A feeling only he seemed to understand. But even as he held on to that simplicity, the world was changing shape around him. And soon, very soon, the boy who couldn't stay in his seat, who skipped drills and outran detentions, would meet something faster than even he could ignore. A system ready to shape a legend. But for now, he was still just the boy who ran too fast. Capital Tre, Champs and Challenges, the high school crucible. William Knibb wasn't just a school, it was a proving ground. A place where potential didn't get applauded. It got tested. The campus sat just outside of Falmouth, and from the outside, it looked like any other Jamaican high school. Sun-washed concrete buildings, faded murals of national heroes, a dusty field with half-bent goalposts. But inside, the atmosphere pulsed with something else. something tighter, sharper, a kind of quiet urgency that told every student, "You're here now. Show us what you're made of." Usain arrived with a duffel bag, a second-hand uniform, and the kind of confidence only a teenager with speed and no shame could carry. He was taller than most of the first years, louder too, walked like he already knew the corridors, laughed like he owned the air. But Nib wasn't impressed. Not right away. The boys there weren't amateurs. They were state finalists, regional record holders, kids who trained like it was already a profession. The sprinters stretched before class. The long jumpers tracked calories. Some even had private coaches who whispered to them like chess masters. Usain stood out, not just for his stride, but for his lack of polish. He was raw speed in a world that prized refinement. Still, he didn't shrink. If anything, he leaned harder into his personality, made jokes during warm-ups, wore his socks too high, did mock commentary during lunch breaks. And here comes Bolt, straight from the canteen to the finish line. Some found him hilarious. Others found him arrogant. But no one could ignore him, especially once he ran. The track wasn't much, just lines painted on a dry, uneven field. But it was enough. Usain stretched once, did a lazy set of high knees, then exploded into a 200-meter burst that made even the older boys turn their heads. Coaches exchanged glances. A stopwatch clicked. Someone muttered, "Lord, look at that stride." And just like that, the whispers started again. Champs. Every Jamaican athlete knew the word. Boys and girls championships, champs for short, was more than a school competition. It was a national ritual. 5 days of pure fire at Kingston's National Stadium. Stadiums packed, broadcasters buzzing, alumni betting money, kids running like their entire future depended on it. Because in truth, it often did. Colleges recruited from champs, sponsors scouted, legends were made. And if you could shine there, even for a moment, you belonged to something bigger than school pride. You became part of the island's sprinting myth. Bolt wanted in. Of course he did. But he didn't understand what it took. Not yet. His first few months at Nib were a blur of adjustment. The classes were harder, the rules stricter, the expectations brutal. He couldn't skip practice anymore without consequences. Couldn't charm his way out of laps. Couldn't rely on natural talent to shield him from structure. And worse, his body started whispering back. It began with stiffness, a tightness in his lower back after training. Then a sharp pulse when he tried to accelerate out of bends. At first, he ignored it, thought it was just soreness, part of getting stronger. But the ache stayed. It moved. It deepened. He tried to hide it. Didn't tell the coach, didn't tell his mom. But his times began to stall. His energy dipped. And for the first time, running felt like work. He hated it. Wellesley noticed it when he came to visit one weekend. Saw his son walking slower than usual, rubbing his spine between classes. "You all right?" he asked. Usain shrugged. "Me just need to stretch more." But Jennifer pressed further later that night. And when he finally admitted it, the pain, the fear, the worry that something was wrong, she didn't scold. She just held his face in her hands and said, "Then we face it. That's all. We face it." At school, the coaches took note, sent him for basic physio, adjusted his schedule. But they didn't slow the program. Not for one boy. Not even for him. Champs was coming, fast. So he pushed on, he trained, he winced, he raced, and sometimes he won anyway. Because that's who he was. Even half fit, he could outpace most. And when he stood at the start line, even with a bandage around his waist and doubts in his chest, he still made people lean forward. One early meet that season, he lined up for the 400 meters. Not his favorite race. Too long, too painful. But a necessary test. The stands were half full. the sun brutal. His hamstrings already tight, he won. Barely. But what stuck with him wasn't the time or the medal. It was the look on his coach's face after the race. Not joy, not anger, but concern. Like he saw the crack in the armor and didn't yet know how deep it ran. The next few weeks blurred into repetition. Wake early, stretch, train, school, stretch again, rest. But even with the routine, something inside Usain began to shift. The freedom he once felt when running, like the earth itself moved beneath him, started to feel conditional. Like it had been borrowed, not given. Some days he flew, others he limped. The pain wasn't constant, but it was unpredictable. Sometimes it flared up after a sprint. Sometimes it vanished for days, only to return mid-race like a cruel joke. Coaches started whispering the word scoliosis. He didn't understand what it meant at first, only that it sounded serious, medical, grown up, and nothing about it felt like joy. But Bolt was stubborn. He didn't want to sit out, didn't want special treatment. He wasn't wired for rest. He wanted to compete, wanted to win, wanted to make noise. So he pushed. And the more he pushed, the more eyes turned toward him. Because Champs was coming. It dominated every conversation at school. Students counted down the days. Posters were taped to walls. Former champions returned to give pep talks. Everyone was assigned a role, from water boys to baton runners to fan section leaders. And in the middle of it all, Usain Bolt found himself expected to be the one. His first time at Champs, he wasn't alone on the bus ride to Kingston, but it felt that way. The older boys wore headphones, zoned in. Some prayed, some slept. Usain looked out the window, watched the hills roll by, the banana trees sway. His hands fidgeted in his lap. His back throbbed. When they arrived, the stadium rose before them like a monument, bigger than any he'd seen. The track shimmered under the sun, clean and perfect. The stands already echoed with voices. There were cameras, reporters, rumors, lightning-fast boys from Calabar, from Kingston College, from every corner of the island, all dressed in colors and tension. He changed into his spikes in silence. The warm-up area was packed with long limbs and hard faces. No jokes here, no clowning. Every runner moved like they'd trained for war. Usain tried to loosen up, bouncing on his toes, flashing a grin. But the energy was too thick, too sharp. This was no local meet. This was something else. He lined up for the 200 meters. He'd run this race 100 times before, but never like this. Never with thousands watching. Never with names he'd only heard on the radio breathing beside him. His lane felt narrow. The track, longer than usual. The starting blocks cold under his fingers. Set. He flinched, caught himself. Bang! He exploded, but not clean. His first few steps were tight, too quick, arms stiff. His rhythm stuttered around the bend. The runners on either side surged. For the first 100 meters, he was behind. And then something snapped. Not in his body, in his brain. He remembered who he was. The stride came back, long, loose, devouring. By the final straight, he was climbing, catching, passing. The crowd roared. He leaned, he crossed. Second place. No gold, no record, but no shame either. And most of all, no collapse. After the race, he collapsed onto the grass, chest heaving. One of the coaches crouched beside him. That, he said, was a test, and you passed. Bolt nodded, eyes closed. He didn't smile. But somewhere inside, a fire rekindled. In the weeks after Champs, something shifted around him. Teachers spoke with more respect. Classmates asked for advice. His coach started using words like future and international. Recruiters sent letters. People he'd never met began to call him the next one. And while his back still ached, he started learning how to manage it. More stretching, more attention. He hated it. Hated every ice bath, every hour spent doing boring core work. But he understood now. This was part of the price. There was one moment, late one afternoon, when he stayed after practice alone. The field was empty, the sun low. He stood in lane 4, hands on hips, staring down the track. Not running, just looking, breathing. Behind him, Coach Fitz Coleman, who had recently joined Nib's staff to help refine Bolt's technique, called out, "You know why you feel so heavy sometimes?" Usain turned. "'Cause me tall?" Fitz laughed. "Number. 'Cause you're carrying people's dreams, and you haven't learned how to set them down between races." Usain didn't answer, but he remembered the words. The second year at Nib, he came back stronger. Not just faster, smarter. He listened more, trained better, still joked, still teased. But there was a new edge now, a quiet focus beneath the grin. He knew what champs was. He knew what it meant. And more importantly, he knew what he meant to others. He wasn't just running for fun anymore. He was running for something. Chapter 4. World Youth, World Stage. There's a moment, somewhere between adolescence and arrival, when a young athlete stops racing classmates and starts racing history. For Usain Bolt, that moment came with a passport stamp and a number pinned to his chest. He was 15 years old, still lanky, still laughing too loud, still tripping over his own legs sometimes. But now he stood among boys from places he couldn't even pronounce. Boys who didn't speak patois. Boys with flags on their tracksuits and medals already hung in their family homes. This wasn't school. This wasn't champs. This was the world. It started with the 2001 Carifta Games in Barbados. A regional meet, sure, but to Usain, it might as well have been the Olympics. He'd never flown on a plane before. Never eaten a hotel breakfast from a buffet. Never worn a national kit. When he zipped up that green, gold, and black uniform for the first time, something inside him shifted. Not in volume. He was still loud as ever, but in focus. In the realization that this running thing wasn't just a game anymore. It was a stage, and the world was watching. His coach, Fitz Coleman, had pulled him aside before they left Jamaica, told him to listen, to learn, to run smart, not just fast. "This is different," he'd said. "No barefoot boys from down the lane. These youths train like machines." Usain had nodded, half serious, half smirking. But deep down, he knew. He felt it. The world was coming. In Barbados, the sun was different. Hotter somehow. The air more humid. The stadium filled with island voices, whistles, vuvuzelas, and the thump of steel drums. He soaked it all in. Walked through the athletes' village like a tourist in a dream. Shook hands with sprinters from Trinidad. High-jumped beside kids from the Bahamas. Tried to trade his training spikes for a Guyanese team hat. But when race day came, the grin faded. Not out of fear. He never feared the track, but out of something newer. Awareness. He was in the 200-meter final, his specialty, his favorite, the one where his stride got to stretch out like a hammock in the wind. When the gun fired, he didn't just run. He floated. Each step seemed to erase the gap between island and island, between boy and man, between potential and performance. He crossed the line first, looked left, then right, unsure if it had really happened. It had. Carifta champion. 21.81 seconds. New games record. He didn't dance, didn't gloat. Just smiled, wide, stunned, disbelieving. Later, when a reporter asked him how it felt, he said, "Like my heart run too." That victory earned him more than a medal. It earned him attention. The Jamaican Athletics Administrative Association took notice. Coaches from abroad jotted down his name. People in suits started talking about next steps. And one of those steps, just months later, would lead him to Hungary. The IAAF World Youth Championships. Debrecen, 2001. It sounded like a spell, like some faraway place made up in a book. But no, it was real. Cold air, tall buildings, white people everywhere. Usain had never felt more Jamaican in his life. He packed ginger tea and canned mackerel in his suitcase, just in case the food didn't sit right. When the team arrived, bundled in team jackets and jet lag, the coaches warned them, "This is the big leagues now. Be serious." And for a moment, just a moment, Bolt tried. He kept quiet during team meetings, listened during warm-up drills, didn't prank anyone. But by day 2, the old energy crept back. He mimicked the Hungarian accent, danced down hotel hallways in socks, dared teammates to do push-ups in elevators. The staff rolled their eyes. But when he stepped on the track, no one laughed. His first heat in the 200 meters was smooth. Too smooth, maybe. He eased up near the end, still winning by daylight. The coaches weren't pleased. "You don't coast at Worlds," they barked. "You finish." Bolt nodded, apologized. But the truth, he'd never had to dig deep yet. He didn't know how. The final was different. The stadium was bigger, the crowd louder, the runners faster. The boy in lane 5, an American, was built like a fridge and looked twice Usain's age. The nerves hit harder this time. Not the scared kind, just buzzing. Like his legs didn't know whether to stretch or bolt. The gun fired. And for the first time in his young career, Usain was behind. Not by much, but enough to feel it. Enough to panic. His long legs tried to catch up. He gritted his teeth, leaned forward too soon, lost form. The finish came and he lunged. Second place. A silver medal. It should have felt good. He was 15 after all, barely out of childhood, and he'd just podiumed on the world stage. But as he stood there, silver ribbon across his chest, something gnawed. A thought he'd never had before. What if I'd pushed harder? Not regret, just recognition. There are levels to greatness. He'd touched the next one, but only brushed it. Now he wanted more. Back in Jamaica, the media had a field day. "Bolt strikes silver," the headlines sang. His photo was on the back page of the Gleaner, hands on hips, grin shy but certain. He didn't read the whole article. He just liked the picture. School welcomed him like a hero. Kids who used to tease him now asked for autographs. Teachers forgave late homework. One boy from another parish tried to race him in the corridor. Bolt gave him a 5-second head start and still won. He was still the same clown, the same chatterbox, but now there was something sharper in his step. He'd been abroad. He'd raced the world. He'd held a medal that wasn't made of plastic. And now people started saying it out loud. This one could be the next big thing. The thing about medals, silver or gold, is that they don't teach you as much as the silence after the race. That quiet moment, once the adrenaline fades, where you're left alone with breath and thoughts and ache. Usain Bolt had stood on a world podium in Debrecen, medal dangling from his neck, flashbulbs bursting around him. And still, the moment that stuck was the walk back to the locker room. Alone. Cold. 1,000 thoughts behind his eyes and one question ringing loudest. What now? He had felt it. The ceiling. Not of his talent, but of his understanding. He had relied so long on rhythm and reach, on those God-given levers of his, that he'd never truly thought about how he ran. But now, after Hungary, after racing boys who weren't afraid of his stride, he began to realize. Running fast and running right weren't the same thing. Back in Jamaica, things didn't slow down. The attention grew. So did the expectation. He was no longer just the tall youth from Trelawney. He was Jamaica's Bolt, and that meant something now. Teachers called him ambassador. Strangers asked for photos. But under all that noise, the first signs of rebellion took root. Not against people, but against pressure. His back still hurt. Not always, not everywhere. But enough. Enough to worry Fitz. Enough to make him skip drills some days or jog easy when others sprinted. Doctors called it scoliosis, a curvature in the spine that was as stubborn as his stride. There was no fix, not really, just management. Physio, stretching, ice, core work, patience. Words Usain wasn't fond of. By 2002, when he was selected for the World Junior Championships, the spotlight had turned white hot. The event would be held on home soil, Kingston, Jamaica. Suddenly, it wasn't just the world watching him. It was his people. A stadium full of aunties and uncles and barefoot kids from Trelawney. It was local heroes and old coaches and men who still called him boy behind his back. It was everyone. And everyone expected him to win. He was still only 15, the youngest athlete ever to compete in a World Junior final. He looked like a kid borrowing his older brother's uniform. And yet, when he stepped onto the track for the 200 meters, all that faded. He was loose, calm, confident in a way that surprised even Fitz. And then he false started, not once, but twice. First time, the crowd gasped. Second time, they groaned. Usain froze, looked at the official, looked down the line, looked at Fitz in the stands, who stood motionless. For a second, it felt like the whole world tilted. But the judges conferred. New rules. One warning. He would stay in. When the gun fired again, he didn't just run. He exploded. 21.12 seconds. World Junior Champion. At 15. The stadium roared. Not clapped, roared. Grown men cried. Women danced in the aisles. The noise rolled down the bleachers like thunder. For a moment, he just stood there, chest heaving, arms raised, face to the sky. And in that instant, something shifted. Not in his legs, but in his mind. Not just, I can win, but I belong here. It's a subtle difference. One comes from talent, the other from belief. Later, they asked him how it felt to win at home. He shrugged. Me like when people shout for me, he said, laughing. But Fitz knew. He saw it in Bolt's eyes. He wasn't racing for medals anymore. He was racing fate. The weeks that followed were chaos. Interviews, press, new gear from Puma. And then came the letter. You've been selected to represent Jamaica at the World Youth Games in France. He didn't blink. He just asked what kind of food they had in Paris. France was colder than expected. The language barrier was real. But by now, Bolt had learned how to tune it all out. He'd learned that the track was the same anywhere. Same curve, same wind, same silence before the gun. And this time, no false starts. He won again. The 200 meters. The crowd was polite. Bolt bowed. But this time, there was no shock on his face. Just a grin, a knowing nod. He was starting to expect this. But behind the results, the struggle deepened. His back ached after every race. Some nights he couldn't sleep. Some mornings he couldn't stretch. The physios said, rest. He said, maybe later. He was addicted now, to the pace, the cheers, the fire in his chest. Rest felt like retreat. Pain he could manage. Losing? Not so much. Fitz grew worried. He'd seen talent burn out before. He sat Usain down after the France trip. You keep running like this without fixing that back, and you'll never make 20. Usain nodded. Said he understood. But in truth, he didn't know how to slow down. Not yet. Capital Femme, the master's hand, Coach Mills, and the reset. Before Glenn Mills, there was only instinct. Usain Bolt ran because it felt good, because his legs wanted to dance before his brain gave them orders. He knew how to win, how to joke, how to glide through pain like it was part of the game. But discipline, structure, long-term planning, those were foreign languages, and he wasn't interested in learning them. Not until the cracks became visible. By late 2003, the Jamaican Federation had seen enough. Bolt's promise was undeniable. His 200-meter gold at World Juniors had set him apart. But his inconsistency was just as glaring. Missed practices, lazy drills, skipped physio sessions. One day he was lightning, the next, a shadow. And that back pain, still there, growing louder. Enter Glenn Mills. He didn't arrive with fireworks. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He observed, quietly. From the bleachers of the UWI Mona track, where Jamaica's next generation trained, Mills would sit with a clipboard and a stopwatch, watching Bolt run with all the brilliance and chaos of a storm. Sometimes he'd nod, often he'd frown, and then one day he asked for a conversation. "Walk with me," Mills said. Bolt thought they were going to lunch. Instead, they walked a loop around the grass fields behind the stadium. Mills didn't lecture. He asked questions about training, about pain, about focus, about legacy. "You want to be great," he said, "but you're training like someone who wants to be remembered for wasting greatness." Bolt was quiet, not defensive, just still. Mills didn't push harder. He just said, "If you want to do this right, I'll be here tomorrow at 7 a.m., not 7:15, not 7:01, 7. He turned and walked away. The next morning, Bolt showed up at 7:12. Mills didn't even look at him, just nodded toward the track. "Start warming up. You're late." That was the beginning of the reset. It wasn't easy. Mills wasn't a yeller, but he didn't bend. If Bolt skipped stretches, practice ended early. If he cut corners, drills were repeated. If he complained, Mills simply said, "Champions don't negotiate with pain, they manage it." It was a clash of worlds. Bolt had never known structure like this. Mills had never coached a talent so wild. But underneath the friction, something started to click. Slowly, quietly. A new rhythm. A new trust. Mills wasn't just fixing form, he was reprogramming belief. He talked about breathing, posture, the angle of the first step. He showed Bolt footage of Michael Johnson and Carl Lewis, not to copy, but to understand efficiency. He rewrote Bolt's diet, sleep habits, even the music he played during warm-ups. And most importantly, he reintroduced fear, not as punishment, but as respect. Respect for the process, respect for the work. They argued. Often. Bolt missed a session to play video games. Mills benched him for a week. Bolt returned with fire in his eyes and won his next race by 10 meters. Mills didn't smile, just jotted down notes. And all the while, the back held on. It was the silent passenger, present in every stretch, every curl, every stride that ended in a grimace. But now it was being treated, not ignored. Mills brought in top physiotherapists, introduced core strengthening routines, mandated rest days. For the first time, Bolt learned the word prevention. And though he hated the slow stuff, Pilates, resistance bands, therapy balls, he began to notice something strange. He could run longer, smoother, faster. 2004 brought proof. The Carifta Games again. Same stadiums, same heat, but a different Bolt. His times dropped, his posture improved. He started finishing races strong instead of coasting through the last 30 meters. And most surprisingly, he stopped showboating. Not because the joy was gone, because the work had finally begun. Mills saw it in his eyes. The shift. The days of instinct alone were over. This was something deeper now. Measured. Focused. Dangerous. When they returned from one of the meets, Mills sat him down. "You're not just a junior sprinter anymore. You're a man with expectations, from the world, from yourself." Bolt nodded. "Do you want to go to the Olympics?" Mills asked. Bolt didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then we have work to do." The road to Athens didn't start with fireworks. It started with drills. Endless, brutal, boring drills. Knee drives. Starts from blocks. Short sprints with weighted sleds. Repeats under the sun until the track shimmered. Bolt hated it. At first. Not because it was hard, but because it wasn't fun. It wasn't freedom. It was repetition. Correction. Silence. The kind of training that left no room for jokes or sideways glances. But Mills wasn't there to entertain him. He was there to sculpt him. Each day became a conversation between body and discipline. No shortcuts, no skipped sets. Some mornings, Bolt would arrive at the track barely awake. Other days, he was sharp, eyes locked, fire in his chest. But Mills never reacted emotionally. He just held the line. Calm, constant, immovable. And it started to show. By early 2004, Bolt was running cleaner. His stride was tighter. His upper body had begun to stabilize. Less swinging, more drive. He was still growing, still lanky, but his mechanics were catching up to his potential. Fitz-Coleman was still around, but the relationship had changed. Mills was now the architect. The plan was clear: qualify for the Olympics. Jamaica hadn't sent a junior to the Olympic 200 meters in decades. But Bolt was different. Everyone knew it. His name was in every newspaper. Coaches whispered about him in the stands. Sponsors circled like hawks. But Mills blocked it all out. He focused on execution. "Run the race before the race," he'd say. "The work you do here is the medal." And Bolt listened. For the first time in his life, he didn't just want to win. He wanted to master the art. That spring, he ran a series of meets across the Caribbean. At one event in Bermuda, the wind howled through the lanes, and the starter's pistol echoed like thunder. Bolt didn't flinch. He ran a 20.25 in the 200 meters, his fastest ever on foreign soil. Mills said nothing, just nodded once. That was enough. But just as momentum built, his back flared again. It came one afternoon during cooldowns. A dull throb turned into a spasm. He winced, tried to hide it. Mills saw it immediately. They stopped training for a week. Therapy, rest, adjustment. And then, the letter came. Official. Sealed. He had been selected for the Jamaican Olympic team, age 17, the youngest male track athlete in the delegation. A national headline overnight. He flew to Athens not as a medal favorite, but as a promise. A question mark wrapped in green, yellow, and gold. Journalists loved the story. The lanky teenager with the baby face and the world junior record. The kid from Trelawney. The natural. But the pressure weighed heavy. At the Olympic Village, surrounded by giants, Bolt felt small again. He watched as athletes from around the world carried themselves with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Focused. Dead silent before warm-ups. No laughing, no music. Just eyes like knives and feet like steel traps. He tried to mimic it, but it wasn't him. In the call room before his heat, his back tensed again. Not enough to scratch, but enough to whisper, "Not today." He lined up anyway. When the gun fired, his start was decent, the bend smooth. But at 120 meters, the pain kicked. Not sharp, but stubborn. He faded. Crossed the line out of contention. No final, no medal, no miracle. The papers called it disappointing. Some said he was overhyped. Others said the injury was an excuse. But Mills said nothing. Just waited until they were alone at the hotel. Then he asked one question. "Do you still want this?" Bolt nodded. But slower this time. He wasn't answering with ego now. He was answering with resolve. The trip home was quiet. No celebrations, no cameras at the airport, just family, teammates, and Glenn Mills, who already had the next phase planned. "We're done with potential," he said. "Now we start building the man." Capital Sex, the 200-meter gamble. Sometimes the biggest risks don't look like risks at all. They look like comfort zones. And for Usain Bolt, that was the 200 meters. It had always been his race. The curve, the slingshot into the straight. The final 80 meters where his legs uncoiled like ropes, lashing at the air while others faded. The 200 meters felt like home. He had world junior records in his pocket, national headlines on his wall, and a stride that made seasoned coaches whisper. But as the world pressed forward, toward the 100 meters, toward sponsorships and instant glory, Bolt stayed loyal to the half lap. Not out of fear, but belief. The 100 was chaos, a blink and it's over kind of war. The 200 was rhythm, strategy, grace under pressure. And Glenn Mills agreed, at least for now. So the plan was simple. Rebuild, refine, and then dominate the 200 meters in 2007. The stakes were high. His critics hadn't forgotten Athens. Injuries had followed him like shadows. Some said he was cursed with too much height, too much torque, too little discipline. But Mills knew better. He saw something most didn't. Bolt was becoming a student of the sport. Each morning began the same. Quiet drills, no shortcuts. Bolt would arrive before sunrise now. Not always bright-eyed, but always there. The boy who once skipped warm-ups was now asking for extra sets. Not because he loved pain, but because he'd begun to respect it. They traveled across Europe that summer. Secondary meets, cool evenings, tracks with cold winds and lukewarm crowds. But Bolt didn't care about the stage. He cared about splits, foot strikes, angles. Mills clocked every step. Together, they broke down each race like film editors. Where did his hips dip? When did his breathing shift? Why did his head tilt at 170 meters? It was meticulous, it was exhausting, and it was working. In Lausanne, he ran 19.88. A personal best. The world noticed, but only slightly. In the shadow of 100-meter titans like Asafa Powell and Tyson Gay, Bolt's progress was seen as promise, not threat. And that suited him just fine. He didn't want the spotlight. Not yet. He wanted to arrive, not announce. By the time the World Championships in Osaka approached, he was sharper than ever. His posture was more upright, his core stronger, his start, while still raw, no longer a liability. But nerves crept in. Osaka was his biggest stage since Athens, and the memory of fading in pain still lingered. In the warm-up area, he felt tight, not injured, just off. "Don't chase it," Mills told him. "Flow into it." He nodded, eyes low, shoulders relaxed. When the gun fired, Bolt burst from the blocks, not explosively, but clean. He floated through the curve, gaining with every step. At 150 meters, he was still second. But his face was calm. At 170, he surged. Shoulders square, arms pumping like pistons. On Doku's Virgil Doxenbier. Silver. Behind Tyson Gay. He had lost, but he wasn't disappointed. Because for the first time at a major championship, he finished healthy. He finished strong. And he looked around and realized, I belong here, not just as a junior, as a man. In the press conference, a journalist asked if he was ready to try the 100 meters next season. He grinned. "If Coach Mills lets me." The room laughed. Mills didn't. He was already planning. After Osaka, something subtle began to shift. Not in his body, not in his times, but in the way people looked at him. He wasn't the lanky teenager anymore, not just a promise. He had medals now, silver, yes, but on the global stage. And even more powerful than the hardware was the way he had moved. The poise, the clean execution, the unmistakable feeling that this kid was just getting started. Back home in Jamaica, the buzz grew louder. Bolt's name was now attached to something dangerous: expectation. Mills didn't say much about the 100 meters at first. Not directly. He'd occasionally bring it up while reviewing film, point out how Bolt's first 30 meters were improving, how his turnover rate, once awkward due to his height, was now smoothing out, how his reaction time, once a liability, was creeping toward elite territory. Just something to think about, he'd say with a shrug. But Bolt was already thinking. Every night. He watched Asafa Powell's races on repeat, studied Morris Green's starts. He even went back to old footage of Ben Johnson, technique only, not the controversy. He wanted to understand the rhythm of the 100 meters, the violence of it, the concentration it demanded. And then one afternoon, during a routine session, he stopped mid-drill. "Coach," he said, catching his breath, "I want to try it, for real." Mills looked up but didn't flinch. "We're not there yet. But I'm ready. Not to run. To listen." Bolt nodded. That was the moment the gamble began. Not with spikes or a stopwatch, but with humility. Mills didn't ease into it. He redesigned Bolt's entire training cycle. Shortened intervals, block work, acceleration mechanics, explosive drills for the glutes and hamstrings. Everything became more compact, sharper, meaner, and it hurt. The 100 meters was a different beast. There was no rhythm to settle into, no long curve to build momentum. Every step had to be perfect, violent, precise. And Bolt, for all his natural grace, had to relearn how to sprint. But he was obsessed now. Obsessed with understanding, with mastering, with proving that he wasn't just a tall 200-meter guy with good top speed. He wanted to own the 100 meters. To take what others said was too short for his frame and bend it to his will. In March 2008, they tested it publicly. A small meet in Kingston. Nothing flashy, but Bolt lined up for the 100 meters. For real. No exhibitions, no jog-throughs. Just the gun and the stopwatch. He ran 10.03. Clean, efficient, powerful. It sent a ripple through the track world. No wind, no fast track. Just a 6'5" man moving like he had no right to move. A month later, he ran again. 9.76. Wind assisted. But still, 9.76. And now the noise was deafening. He's coming. He's next. He's the one. But Mills wasn't finished. He made Bolt run a 200 the next weekend, just to stay grounded, just to remind him where it all began. Bolt smiled, obliged, and won by a margin so wide the TV cameras lost the second-place finisher. In April, Mills made it official. "You're running the 100 in New York, against Tyson Gay, no hiding." Bolt nodded. The gamble was no longer a whisper. It was real, public, global. The 200 had given him comfort. The 100 was now offering something else: revolution. But with it came pressure. Every stride now mattered. Every stumble would be a headline. And Bolt could feel it in his chest, in the way the air felt heavier at practice, in the way every interview began with, "So, how fast do you think you can go?" He smiled through it. But Mills knew better. He saw the tightening in Bolt's shoulders, the restless eyes, the desire to skip the grind and chase the glory. So he reminded him, the race is won in the work, not in the stadium. And Bolt believed him, because now, at last, he understood. The 200 had made him famous. But the 100 could make him immortal. Chapter 7, 9.72. A Star is Born. New York was humid that evening, sticky with early summer sweat and the kind of tension you can't quite name. It clung to the track, to the crowd, to the athletes lacing up their spikes like soldiers before battle. Randall's Island had seen fast men before, but not this. Not yet. Usain Bolt stepped onto the track with his usual loping gait, but something in him had shifted. He wasn't dancing. No exaggerated waves. No mimed arrow through the sky. He looked straight ahead, jaw set, his long frame humming with silent electricity. This wasn't play anymore. This was something else. It was May 31st, 2008, the Adidas Grand Prix. A checkpoint on the international track calendar, not a world championship, not an Olympic final. But this meet, under a warm New York sky, was about to become something else entirely. Something mythic. Only a handful of insiders had truly seen it coming. Glenn Mills had been watching for months. He knew what was building brick by brick, stride by stride. Bolt's training had shifted after Osaka. No more long curves and gradual builds. Everything was compact now. Brutal, sharp, explosive. Starts from blocks, maximum velocity drills, plyometrics until his calves begged for mercy. Bolt didn't complain. Not anymore. He felt it too. The storm inside him gathering force. The feeling that his body, his mind, his purpose, everything was about to collide. Reporters buzzed around the stadium like wasps, but they didn't know what to expect. Tyson Gay was the favorite, the world champion, the proven threat. Bolt was still the 200-meter guy, tall, flashy, unproven over the short dash. 100 meters was a game of raw violence, not elegance, not grace. And yet, Bolt had been quietly sharpening his blade. A few weeks earlier, at a small meet in Jamaica, he'd dropped 9.76 seconds. Wind-assisted, yes, but real enough to send a chill through the sprinting world. It wasn't just the time. It was the look of it. Loose, unforced. Like someone skipping downhill while others clawed against gravity. Now, under the bright lights of New York, he had a lane next to Gay. The stadium hushed as the athletes took their marks. Bolt shook out his arms once, inhaled slowly, dropped into the blocks. Set. The gun cracked. Bolt's start wasn't perfect, but it was no longer a liability. He stayed lower than usual, compact and controlled, firing his legs like pistons. For the first 30 meters, it looked like Gay might hold him off. But then, just past the halfway mark, Bolt did something that made the world blink. He unfolded. It wasn't a sprint so much as an uncoiling of a force that physics hadn't accounted for. His stride lengthened, but not lazily. His turnover stayed fast. He moved like liquid over steel, grace over fire. And the gap appeared, clean, obvious, inevitable. By 70 meters, he was clear. By 80, he glanced to the side, just briefly. By 90, he eased his chest upright. By 10 o'clock, the clock read 9:72. A world record. The crowd exploded. A wave of sound rolled over the track, through the camera crews, up into the sky. Bolt raised his arms, almost confused, his eyes wide. A grin split across his face like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Neither could the world. He'd done it in front of the American crowd, on Tyson Gay's turf, at a non-championship meet no less, with almost no build-up, no hype, just presence. Gay himself walked over, half smiling, half stunned. "That was real?" he asked. Bolt just shrugged, still smiling, still in disbelief. And then the replays began. Every angle, every stride, slowed down and analyzed. His start? Better. His drive phase? Crisp. His transition? Flawless. His top-end speed? terrifying. He had just run faster than any human in history and made it look like a warm-up jog. Back in Jamaica, the news exploded like a cannon. Radios screamed, churches cheered, kids in schoolyards mimicked his lean and stretch. The Prime Minister called. So did Puma's CEO. Everyone wanted a piece of the man who had turned 100 meters into jazz. And still, Bolt wasn't sure what he'd just done. That night in his hotel room, he lay awake with headphones in, watching the race on loop. Not out of vanity, out of curiosity. Trying to find the gear he shifted into. The moment where things broke from logic and entered something else. He texted Glenn Mills. "Did that really happen?" Mills wrote back 5 minutes later. "Yes, and it wasn't even perfect." Bolt stared at the ceiling, laughed, because that was the part no one knew yet. He could go faster. Back in Jamaica, a quiet storm had begun to roll across the island. The news broke fast, but the feeling traveled even faster. Radios howled, phones buzzed, people spilled out of bars and corner shops, pointing at replay screens and grinning like they'd all just won something. And in a way, they had. Because 9.72 wasn't just a world record, it was proof. Proof that the boy from Trelawney, who used to race goats and argue about mango trees, now ran faster than any human ever had. And not by accident, not by fluke, but by design. The elders in the village shook their heads and smiled. Bolt's primary school coach, an old man with a slower step and a proud stare, sat in front of his radio with a red stripe in hand, whispering, "Me tell them. Long time me tell them." In Kingston, the sports ministry called an emergency press conference. Not for damage control, but celebration. Sponsors lit up. Puma pushed a global campaign into immediate overdrive. Emails flew between Europe and North America, asking how soon Bolt could be packaged, promoted, and paraded. Everyone wanted a piece. But Glenn Mills kept the shield up. No distractions. Olympics are next, he told every camera, every mic, every executive. Bolt tried to stay grounded, but the air felt different now. He couldn't walk through Norman Manley Airport without being mobbed. Little boys followed him through the parking lot, mimicking his strides. Teenagers copied his hair. Newspapers called him Lightning before the nickname had even properly stuck. He wasn't used to this, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Fame, it turned out, was a different kind of pressure. It wasn't just about running fast anymore. It was about expectation, headlines, hype, the kind that stalks you through airports and echoes in empty hotel rooms. Mills saw the weight beginning to creep in. So he pulled Bolt aside and said something simple. "You can be a star or you can be a legend. Choose." Bolt didn't answer right away. But the question stayed with him. In every early morning session, in every strength circuit, in every quiet moment when the applause faded and only his breath remained. Meanwhile, the sprinting world was spiraling. Track purists called it a fluke. Too tall, they said. Too soon. Others claimed he wouldn't last. His frame wasn't built for longevity. Too much wind resistance. Too much strain on the spine. Commentators debated technique, turnover rate, biomechanics. But none of that mattered when you watched the tape. Because what Bolt had done didn't look like sprinting. It looked like freedom. And that, more than the time, was what people remembered. In New York, ESPN ran a feature on him for 3 nights straight. Not just sports segments, primetime storytelling. They called him the fastest man alive, but also the most fun the sport has had in decades. He laughed, he smiled, he played. But behind the charm, there was something sharpening. He'd tasted it now, the edge of history, the thin, bright line between great and untouchable. Back at training, Mills wasn't celebrating. He was dissecting. "Your first 20 still needs polish," he told Bolt, pointing at the screen. Bolt sighed. "But I broke the world record." Mills didn't blink. That doesn't mean you did it right. So they went back to the blocks, over and over. Mornings of start drills, afternoons of resistance runs, video feedback. Bolt, drenched in sweat, sometimes rolled his eyes. But he never stopped. Because now, the goal wasn't just to be the fastest, it was to stay there. And the Olympics were 8 weeks away. Beijing was coming. Tyson Gay had already declared he'd be ready. The Americans were circling, hungry for redemption. The Jamaicans, meanwhile, whispered that this might be the year, that the medals, long owned by the U.S., could finally cross the Caribbean Sea for good. And Bolt, somewhere in the middle of it all, began to dream bigger. It wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about changing the game. He told his friends in secret, "I'm going to break the 200-meter world record too." They laughed. "You just ran 9.72 and you're still greedy?" But Bolt wasn't joking. He saw something the others didn't. He felt something. Like he had more in reserve. Like the real record, his record, was still ahead of him. He wrote 9.6 on a small scrap of paper and tucked it in his travel bag. Not for the world, just for him. A reminder, a target, a promise. And yet, in public, he kept smiling. That summer, before Beijing, he appeared on television across 12 countries. He danced on set. He posed for photos. He joked with kids. But every night when the doors closed, he trained. Harder than ever. He watched film of Carl Lewis, of Maurice Greene, of Michael Johnson, not to copy, but to understand. What made them great? What made them feared? And more importantly, how could he be different? Because Bolt didn't want to be remembered just for being fast. He wanted to be unforgettable. By the time the Olympic Village opened in August, he was ready. Not perfect, but sharp, hungry, and aware that the world now had their eyes on him, not as an underdog, but as the man to beat. 9.72 had cracked the door, but now he wanted to blow it off its hinges. And Beijing was waiting. Chapter 8. Shadows Before Lightning. There were no fireworks in Osaka. No anthems echoing through the streets. No cameras craning to catch every breath, every blink. Just a soft hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of speakers in multiple languages, and the muted shuffle of shoes on synthetic track. For a city so big, the 2007 World Championships felt strangely small. And that suited Glenn Mills just fine. He didn't want noise. He wanted clarity. And clarity, he knew, often came in silence. Usain Bolt stood at the edge of the track, his long frame still stretching into adulthood, and watched a race he wasn't running. His shoulders were loose, but his fingers twitched. In his chest was that old, familiar rhythm. Thump, pause, thump, pause. A heartbeat that didn't quite trust the calm. He was used to chaos, to noise, to proving things with laughter or speed. But here, in Osaka, something quieter was required. This wasn't Beijing. This wasn't history yet. This was rehearsal. And for the first time, Bolt was beginning to understand that even legends have to earn their echoes. He was 20 now. Tall. Taller than most sprinters. Longer than most believed a sprinter should be. Coaches still whispered, too lanky, too loose, too wild. And Glenn Mills, calm, patient, calculating, let them talk. He didn't argue anymore, because he saw what they didn't. He saw the boy finally learning how to wait. Training had shifted that year. Less bravado, more intention. Less of Bolt skipping drills or faking stretches. More questions, real questions. The kind that signaled something inside him had tilted. Not a dramatic transformation, just a slow recalibration. Mills had introduced new routines. Plyometrics, race modeling, curve mechanics. He didn't expect perfection. He expected presence. And Bolt, for once, started to give it to him. He'd show up early sometimes, not every day, but enough. Enough to make Mills raise an eyebrow and nod, almost imperceptibly. There was still the dancing, still the joking, still the occasional snack sneaked between reps. But it was different now. Not a mask, more like ballast, something to balance the weight of what was coming. Because Bolt knew what was coming, not just bigger races, but expectation, not just rivals, but the kind of pressure that doesn't blink. And Osaka. Osaka was the threshold. His room in the athlete village overlooked a concrete courtyard with a single crooked tree in the middle. Every morning, he'd open the curtain and stare at that tree, just for a second, before brushing his teeth, stretching, and heading out for breakfast. He never told anyone why, but the truth was simple. It didn't move. That tree. It was stubborn. Still, and in a life defined by motion, Bolt started to admire stillness. He had never run like that before. Quietly. Heats came and went. No flailing, no mockery. Just steps. Clean steps. Intentional arms. Sharp drive. His times weren't mind-blowing, but they were clean. Controlled. Glenn Mills watched every one of them, arms folded, face unreadable. And behind closed doors, he said the one thing Bolt hadn't heard before. That looked grown. Bolt had laughed, but he heard it, and it stuck. He didn't win the 100th. Tyson Gay did. Gay was a bullet that year. Tight, compact, businesslike. His form was machine-made. His mind locked in. Bolt, by comparison, was still experimenting, still adjusting to the short sprint's ruthless demands. Reaction time, drive phase, acceleration, the smallest misstep magnified. He placed second, and it hurt. But not like before, not with bitterness, more like hunger, the kind that lingers in your stomach long after the crowd's gone home. He walked back to the warm-up area with a towel around his neck and the taste of sweat in his mouth, and for the first time in his young career, he didn't crack a joke, didn't brush it off, just nodded slowly, eyes on the ground, and whispered something under his breath. No one caught it, except Mills, who later said, "That was the day he realized the show doesn't matter if the act falls flat." There was still the 200th, his event, the bend, the stretch, the release. Bolt felt different stepping onto the track for that final. Not heavy, not nervous, just alert. His legs twitched the way they always did, but his breath was slower now, deeper. He glanced up at the sky once, out of habit, and then down at his lane. Lane 6, the outside. He liked that. No one to chase. No one to pace. Just the curve and the clock and the possibility of redemption. The gun cracked. Bolt flew. Not wild, not reckless, but composed. He didn't win gold. Tyson Gay did again. Gay was on fire that week. But Bolt ran a personal best. Silver. And something more valuable than the medal. He finished with no regrets, no wasted energy, no foolish starts, no doubts about what could have been. Just pure sprinting. And that was new. When they returned to Jamaica, there were no parades, no TV specials. But something had changed. Bolt wasn't just a funny kid with long legs anymore. He was a contender. A real one. The media buzzed about Tyson Gay, about the coming Beijing Olympics, about Asafa Powell and his world-leading times. But beneath the surface, those paying closer attention started whispering a new name. Bolt. Not as a gimmick, not as a maybe, but as a storm on the horizon. Glenn Mills didn't congratulate him too loudly. He didn't want to disturb the balance. Instead, he gave Bolt a few weeks off, told him to eat what he wanted. Rest, play video games, recharge. Because next year, he said, We stop hiding. And Bolt had nodded, quietly, because deep down, he was tired of hiding too. He still smiled for cameras, still danced when the mood struck him. But there was a shadow now behind the smile, a deeper note in his voice. He started to train without music sometimes, started to ask for tape of his own races, started to sit, post-workout, and just breathe for 10 minutes before leaving the track. He still showed up late now and then, still teased the younger sprinters. But the boy who once ran from chores had become a man running toward something. Something big. Late one night, in his room back home, Bolt sat cross-legged on his bed, watching an old race of Michael Johnson's, the 200-meter final from Atlanta. That iconic run, 19.32. Gold shoes, upright posture, perfect angles. Bolt watched it 3 times. Then he turned the TV off and sat in the dark. Not thinking, just seeing. Seeing what could be. Osaka hadn't given him gold, but it had given him conviction. That was more valuable. It was the invisible thing. The shift, the whisper behind the roar. It was the knowledge that talent meant nothing without control, and control meant nothing without vision. Mills had known it all along, had seen that the only way Bolt could fly was if he first learned to stand still. And now he could. For the first time, he could. So when people later asked Glenn Mills, "When did you know Bolt was ready for greatness?" He didn't say Beijing. He didn't say the world record or the golden spikes or the pounding chest in the final stretch. He said, Osaka. Because Osaka wasn't lightning. It was the moment before the storm. The moment the clouds started to shift. And somewhere inside those clouds, the quiet fire began to burn. Not loud, not fast, just steady. Steady enough to ignite the sky the following year, and never look back. Kapitel Nun, Berlin and beyond, the making of a legend. Berlin, August 2009. The old city breathed with history, thick with memory, layered in brick and echo. You could still feel the Cold War in the cracks of the wall, still sense the tremble of past parades through the boulevards. But for 1 week in late summer, Berlin wasn't thinking about walls, about history, about politics. The city was watching the track. More precisely, it was watching him. Usain Bolt had returned. Not as a question mark this time, not as the gifted showman with the gold spikes and wild grin. This was not the kid who shocked the world in Beijing. No, this was the man who now carried something heavier. Expectation, legacy, destiny. And if the Olympic Games had been his arrival, then Berlin would become the stage where myth turned into monarchy. Because here, he wasn't just racing time, he was chasing perfection. Glenn Mills had seen it building for months. The confidence was still there. Of course it was. But there was less giggling now, fewer dance moves before training. Bolt was serious. He wanted to get better. He wanted to refine. The workouts were harder, the drills more brutal. Film sessions became clinics on biomechanics. No more relying on raw talent alone. And in private, Mills would say quietly, almost to himself, Beijing was emotion. Berlin will be execution. The world had noticed too. When Bolt arrived in Berlin, the cameras followed like satellites. Children waved miniature Jamaican flags at the airport. Reporters camped out by his hotel. Fans leaned over fences just to glimpse his stride during warm-ups. And yet, despite all the noise, Bolt floated through it like smoke through an open field. Unbothered, unworried, untouchable. He smiled in press conferences, joked with the volunteers, took pictures with security guards. But behind the smile, his mind was already on lane 4, on the start blocks, on the world record graphic waiting to be updated. The 100 meters began, as it always does, with whispers. The heats were straightforward. Bolt cruised, coasting across the line like he was late for dinner but not in a rush. The quarterfinals, same thing. He didn't waste energy. He didn't reveal everything. But those watching closely could see it. The sharpness in his drive phase, the economy in his form, the stillness in his face. By the semifinals, the atmosphere inside the Olympia Stadion had shifted. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were waiting. For something impossible. For something holy. And that set the stage for the final. The sun had just started to dip behind the grand arches of the stadium. Shadows lengthened across the track. Over 70,000 people leaned forward in perfect unison. Tyson Gay, the American bullet who had missed Beijing due to injury, stood ready, looking carved out of stone. He was running better than ever, 9.89 in the semi, seemingly without strain. Asafa Powell, ever the threat, still waiting for his Olympic-level moment. And Bolt, of course, stood in lane 4, legs humming with stored lightning, arms loose, eyes focused. There was no show this time, no finger-pointing, no dancing, just a breath, then silence, then the gun. Bolt's start wasn't flawless, but it was enough. His reaction time wasn't the fastest, but it didn't matter. Because by 30 meters, he had closed the gap. By 40, he was upright and flying. By 50, he was already beyond them. And from there, he simply disappeared. Stride after stride, the gap widened. Tyson Gay, running the race of his life at 9.71, looked like he was standing still. Powell couldn't hold form. The stadium erupted before the finish line. Bolt didn't pound his chest this time. He didn't look left or right. He drove through the tape with a clean, ruthless fury. The clock, 9.58 seconds. It didn't make sense. People screamed, not with joy at first, but with confusion, shock. Eyes darted to the giant screen as if waiting for correction. But the numbers stayed frozen. 9,58. The fastest time a human being had ever recorded over 100 meters. The margins? Unthinkable. Bolt had shattered his own world record by 0.11 seconds, a chasm in sprinting terms. No wind advantage, no altitude, just pure, technical, blistering execution. Later that night, scientists would pore over the footage like priests reading scripture. They'd analyze stride length, ground contact time, hip angle, hamstring elasticity. Some tried to explain it. Most couldn't. He was too tall, his turnover too fast. His acceleration curve defied established norms. At 6 feet 5 inches, he should have peaked later. But Bolt somehow peaked twice, once at 40 meters, again at 80. He wasn't just fast, he was an exception to biology. And he had done it with the whole world watching. The 200 meters in Berlin wasn't just a formality, even if some believed it would be. To those who didn't know Bolt, who thought he might coast now that the 100 was conquered, it may have seemed like an afterthought. But to him, it was never just another race. The 200 wasn't a sideshow. It was his cornerstone, the distance that had shaped his stride, his rhythm, his identity as a runner long before the spotlight ever found him. The 100 made him famous, but the 200 had built him. And on that night, under the heavy glow of the Olympia Stadion lights, Bolt felt something stir that was deeper than ambition. It was personal, almost private. The kind of race where you don't chase records. You chase yourself. As he stood on the curve, waiting for the silence that would fall just before the gun, he rolled his shoulders once, then again, settling into stillness. His fingers danced briefly against the red track, feeling its texture, its temperature, the slight give beneath his fingertips. The curve of lane 5 lay in front of him like a question, and he was ready to answer it, not with words, not even with speed, but with something harder to define. The gun cracked, and he surged forward, not just with power, but with elegance, as if each muscle was timed to a melody only he could hear. His body didn't fight the curve. It embraced it, swept through it, sliced the air without effort. His strides were long but controlled, his torso upright but relaxed. He wasn't chasing anyone. He was pulling away from gravity itself. And when he came off the bend and into the straight, something unspoken happened. Something that could only be felt by those who watched closely. There was no hesitation, no dip in energy, no glance sideways. Just pure, unbroken momentum. Every step was an affirmation that he was still in full command, still ascending. He didn't ease up before the finish this time. He drove through it, eyes locked ahead, jaw set, arms piston straight. The clock stopped at 1919, and the world exhaled not in disbelief, but in surrender. Because by now it was clear. This wasn't luck. This wasn't hype. It wasn't even dominance anymore. It was evolution. In the press tribune, seasoned journalists blinked at their laptops, their fingers stuttering on the keys. In the VIP stands, sponsors and dignitaries looked at each other not with glee, but with a kind of respectful confusion, like they'd just witnessed something too clean, too fast, too beautiful to fully absorb in real time. On the track, Bolt smiled. Not the wild, boyish grin of Beijing, but something calmer, fuller. He looked not at the scoreboard, but at the curve, as if to say, I knew it was in me. Then he raised his hands, not to boast, but to breathe. The cameras caught it, of course, the moment where the showman and the craftsman became one. And the crowd? They didn't just cheer, they stood. They had watched him dismantle physics, not once, but twice. First in the 100, now in the 200. And yet it wasn't the times that lingered. It was how he did it. With grace. With control. With something strangely intimate. Like he was letting them in on a secret, just for a second. When Bolt finally left the stadium that night, wrapped in a Jamaican flag, his headphones back over his ears, there was a different kind of silence that followed him. Not the hush before a gunshot, not the stillness of a crowd holding its breath, but the quiet that comes after something sacred. Something finished. Something that doesn't need words. He didn't speak much to reporters that evening. Just a few nods, a grin, a line or two about the training, about the curve, about how Glenn Mills had told him this was possible if he trusted the process. But later, alone in the athlete lounge, while the crowd noise echoed faintly through the corridors and the other sprinters came and went in waves of chatter and exhaustion, Bolt sat by a window and looked out at the now dark track. He didn't take a selfie. He didn't text anyone. He just leaned back in the chair, hands folded behind his head, and stared. And then, softly, to no one in particular, he said, "That's the best I'll ever run." Not in defeat, not in sadness, but in peace. He knew that some nights don't repeat, that some lines on a track don't fade when the lights go out, that some performances are so clean, so complete, so utterly aligned with every ounce of what you were born to do, that trying to explain them would only cheapen the magic. And Berlin had been exactly that. Capital Zine, the final stretch. Fame, farewell, and forever. By 2013, the world no longer watched Bolt to see if he would win. They watched to see how. Would he joke on the start line again? Would he blow kisses to the camera? Would he glance sideways before crossing the line, arms out like wings? Every race had become a kind of ritual, a shared understanding between him and the planet, that even if time kept ticking, Bolt had figured out how to bend it. The medals kept coming. Moscow, Beijing, Rio. There were setbacks along the way, rainy tracks, aching hamstrings, the occasional stumble out of the blocks. But none of it ever seemed to stick. He was still the fastest man alive. Still the face of Olympic joy. Still the kid from Trelawney with the thunder in his legs. But inside the rhythm of races and the weightless seconds that made him feel immortal, a different clock was ticking. One he couldn't beat. Because no one outruns time. His body was changing. The back flared up more often. Recovery took longer. Training, once a game of joy and improvement, began to feel like maintenance. There were mornings he didn't bounce out of bed. Mornings where stretching hurt more than sprinting. Mornings when Glenn Mills would raise an eyebrow and say, "You're not 22 anymore, you know." Bolt would laugh. But quietly, he knew. The boy who once made running look like dancing was now stretching every muscle just to stay light on his feet. And the world around him was changing too. There were new names now: Johann Blake, Justin Gatlin, Andre DeGrasse. Fast, hungry, fearless. They didn't care about Bolt's medals or legacy. They weren't chasing a myth. They were chasing a title. And that title still had his name on it. In 2015, the World Championships in Beijing felt like déjà vu. But the atmosphere had shifted. Bolt wasn't the surprise anymore. He was the target. Every sprinter lined up beside him carried the same hope. Maybe today, the king stumbles. But he didn't. He edged out Gatlin by a whisker in the 100 meters, a race so tight it felt like fate was holding its breath. It wasn't his fastest time, but it was one of his proudest wins. Not because he dominated, but because he endured. And that, more than anything, was becoming his quiet mission, to leave on his own terms. With dignity. With the smile still real. With the world still watching not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. In 2016, the Olympics returned, and so did Bolt. Rio de Janeiro, with its beaches and rhythms and wild, joyful chaos, felt like the perfect setting for a farewell tour. The Brazilian sun bounced off his skin like an old friend, and the crowd sang his name with a kind of warmth that made everything feel lighter. He moved through the village like a legend in residence, still cracking jokes, still taking selfies, still making time for every fan who waved a Jamaican flag in his direction. The races came one by one. 100 meters, gold. 200 meters, gold. 4 times 100 meters, gold. 3 more medals, 3 more snapshots in Olympic history. 3 more moments when the world, even if just for 9 or 19 seconds, remembered how it felt to believe in magic. It wasn't his fastest Olympics. The times weren't earth-shattering, but the poise was. The calm, the control, the sense that this man knew exactly who he was, what he meant, and what he was about to let go of. After Rio, the end was inevitable. He announced it without fanfare, just a quiet statement. The 2017 World Championships in London would be his final competition. The place where he had lit up the 2012 Games. The stadium that had roared louder for him than for the British themselves. It felt right. Still, the months leading up to it felt different. The training had less bounce. The interviews had more reflection. His usual jokes were still there, but sometimes they came with a pause, like he was savoring the role one last time before the curtain fell. When he arrived in London that August, the air was thick with emotion. Fans held signs that read, "Thank you, Usain." Former competitors sent flowers. Stadium announcers stumbled through their lines trying to sound cheerful. And through it all, Bolt smiled. He always smiled. But inside, he wasn't sure how it would feel to let go. He had spent over a decade as the center of every camera, every medal ceremony, every whispered hope from a child with spikes too big. His name was more than a name. It was a sensation, a memory, a spark. And when you live at that altitude for so long, it's hard to picture the world from ground level. Still, he was ready. He just hoped his body would let him say goodbye properly. The stadium in London that night was filled with anticipation, but there was also something quieter hanging in the air. Something like reverence. This was not just another championship final. It was a farewell. Not to a runner, but to an era. Bolt crouched in lane 4 for the 100 meters, his eyes focused but different now, less wild, more grounded. He looked not like a hunter, but like a man writing his last chapter. Around him stood younger bodies, sharper forms, men without the weight of history on their shoulders. The starter raised his arm, and the hush fell over 60,000 people. The gun fired, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Bolt didn't lead. His start was slow, his reaction a fraction off. He pumped his arms and clawed into the race, fighting through muscle memory and time itself, closing with every stride. But the finish line came too soon. Gatlin crossed first, then Coleman, then Bolt. Third. The crowd didn't know how to react. There were gasps, silence, then applause, loud and messy and full of love. Because they weren't cheering the result. They were cheering the journey. And Bolt? He smiled. He hugged the winners, raised their hands, took the bronze with grace. No complaints, no excuses, just a bow to the crowd and then to the sport that had carried him this far. It wasn't the ending the movies would have written, but it was human, and perhaps in some ways more beautiful because of that. The final goodbye came in the 4 by 100 meters. Jamaica's team lined up with pride, but something felt off. Bolt could sense it in the warm-ups, in the tension of the air. Still, he took the anchor leg as always, trusting the process one last time. The baton came late, the lane was crowded, and then, halfway through his final stretch, his body gave out. His hamstring tore. He crumpled. The stadium froze. Bolt tumbled to the track, not with a crash, but like a monument slowly collapsing. He didn't cry out. He didn't punch the ground. He simply tried to stand. And he did. He limped toward the finish line, carried by instinct, supported by teammates. The crowd stood with him, every second stretching into eternity. Not for the gold, not for the time, but for the man. Because this was Bolt's final act. Not a sprint, but a walk. Not a record, but a statement. I finish what I start. It was raw. It was painful. It was heroic. And in some strange, poetic way, it was perfect. After London, Bolt retired for real. No more spikes. No more cameras in the warm-up area. No more championship call rooms with fluorescent lights and anxious silence. He faded from the track, but not from the world. He tried football for a moment, trained with clubs, played in friendlies. But the old magic didn't translate to the ball. The rhythm was different. The spotlight felt foreign without the lanes. And after a brief dance with the sport, Bolt let it go. Instead, he turned to what he'd always done best: connect. He traveled. He smiled his way through media events, foundations, ambassador roles. He started businesses, produced music, mentored kids. In every room he entered, the mood changed. He didn't need the clock anymore. His presence was enough. And everywhere he went, people still asked, what was it like? That feeling, that moment, when the world chased you and you outran it all? He would grin, shrug, sometimes say, it was fun, man. Sometimes, nothing at all. Because how do you explain lightning? Years passed, but the footage never aged. The 9.58 clip was replayed 1,000,000 times. The celebration before the finish in Beijing became the stuff of folklore. Children who hadn't even been born during his prime wore yellow wristbands and mimicked his pose. His name became more than a name. It became rhythm, culture, light. And through it all, Bolt stayed Bolt. He didn't become a myth. He didn't hide behind nostalgia or chase relevance. He laughed the same, danced the same, waved at fans like they were cousins. There was no bitterness, no yearning, just a quiet knowing that he had done something no one else ever had, and perhaps never would again. One day, during an interview for a sports documentary, the host asked him, "Do you miss it?" He paused, looked out the window. The trees moved slowly. Somewhere in the distance, kids were running, barefoot and wild, shouting each other's names. And then he said, not the races, but the feeling, when everything disappears except the next step. Yeah, that I miss. It wasn't fame he mourned. It wasn't speed. It was the freedom. The rare, almost sacred moments when body and mind were in such perfect harmony that the world vanished. When he wasn't thinking, just flying. That feeling, he had tasted it more than anyone. And that was enough. Today, Usain Bolt stands not as a retired sprinter, but as a living monument to joy, to grace, to the sheer, impossible thrill of being fully alive in motion. He changed the sport, yes. He redefined speed. But more than that, he reminded the world that greatness doesn't have to be solemn. That power can smile. That legends can laugh. He came from a small town. He danced on the biggest stage. He left on his own terms. And the track? The track remembers. From the dusty hills of Trelawney to the brightest lights the world has ever seen, Usain Bolt didn't just run. He danced, he smiled, he rewrote the rules. And maybe that's why we remember him. Not just for the records, but for the joy, the ease, the feeling that somehow he was always running for us, not just for himself. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the journey, feel free to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It means more than you think. This is the Sport Whisper, where we don't just tell you what happened. We try to make you feel it. Until next time, keep listening.